Thank you.
Now we're joined by Bhairavi Desai, Executive Director of the really grassroots Taxi Workers Alliance she helped found and which has more recently taken into its midst the Uber and Lyft workers and who just led Fist Aloft, the largest demonstration in the U.S. of Uber, Lyft drivers taking it to the streets, literally and figuratively, and driving the protesters straight to the corporate boardroom against technology as a tool for wage theft. And we're going to have her just for a limited time because our dear sibling is a bit under the weather and we don't want to strain her too much. But it's so good to have you, Bhairavi Desai, and I was wondering if you wanted to lead off with any thoughts that John Logan had raised relevant to the issue of the immigrant workforce, since so many of the workers that you're involved with, tens of thousands of taxi workers and Uber and Lyft workers, are those hard-working immigrants that are railed against by the economic populists and by the Trumpians.
Well, thank you so much, Mimi and Ken. It's great to be back on air with you all. I was listening to Professor Logan's comments, and actually what I wanted to kind of build up on was, his comments around how this, Project 2025 has some really serious, I think, existential threats to the labor movement, which we cannot take lightly. I mean, as the professor mentioned, there would be a ban on public sector unions, but it goes beyond that. So, for example, they, under Project 2025, one of the things is to remove a 3-year ban for decertifications after an election. So basically that means, once there's an election and, the union is going into a phase to negotiate a contract for those 3 years, except for limited reasons, there's a ban on decertification campaigns. And so that way, when the workers that have elected their new union are not in a position of constant battle as they're trying to negotiate their contract. Well, under Project 2025, that ban would be removed. And so unions would be in a perpetual fight, to get to the table, to basically win against existential threats, so you're very right to exist, which means your ability to put all your resources, your time, your staffing, all your attention, the focus for your rank and file around winning a respectable, dignified contract. All of that gets weakened, right? Because your forces would have to be diverted for an existential threat. There's, and also a part of Project 2025, one of the proposals would be to rescind what's called the persuader rule. So the persuader rule is something that Obama, first put into place, which it would require employers to disclose when they hire union busting consultants. And so this is something that the Trump administration during the first administration, had tried to block. The Biden-Harris administration said that, that they would bring that rule back in. But Project 2025 has said its eyes on it. I mean, we're talking about in Project 2025, even allowing states to ban labor unions, to ban overtime, first to allow states to not have to follow federal minimum wage laws, even eliminating child labor laws. I mean, these are significant attacks on unions as the institutions of the working class, really on the working class and the working poor as a whole. I mean, I think we talk a lot about dystopia, and I think in your very first question, Mimi, you asked, is it hyperbole? And I think that's a really important question, because so often in activism and in left activism, where you're constantly trying to move the line forward into a more progressive, just, humane, society, you constantly talk about the lack of these things as being a fundamental attack. But it is not hyperbole to say that these are serious existential attacks on unions and on the right of the working class and the poor to have a dignified life as we know it. And this would set back, people, the working class and the poor for generations to come.
And baby, I wanted to bring in your current dispute with regard to the Uber and Lyft drivers, which is an attack by the companies there for a long-standing agreement with regard to their shift jobs. Could you explain that to us?
Yes, so as Mimi mentioned, Ken, last Wednesday, over 2,000 of our Uber and Lyft members marched. First we had a protest outside City Hall, and then we marched from City Hall to downtown Uber's headquarters. We've been protesting basically lockouts. I mean, we know that, companies will lock out workers. In the case of Uber and Lyft, what it means is that in the middle of your shift, where you could have dropped off a fare, you get a message on your app that you're unable to go online. Now, mind you, that unlike other workers, Uber and Lyft drivers are responsible for all the expenses. When you can't go to work, it means you're paying for all your expenses out of pocket. Uber and Lyft basically tell you to drive around aimlessly to a so-called busy area, except that even when you have dropped off a fare in a busy area, you see that they're surging to the public, meaning they're charging the public more because they're saying that there's a lack of drivers, that supply is lower than demand, but they're still keeping the drivers locked out of work. They are doing this for two reasons. One, and Uber started the lockout at the end of May, beginning of June. Uber started the lockouts in order to artificially manipulate the amount of time the companies have to report to the Taxi and Limousine Commission, our regulator, that the amount of empty time that the drivers have, that the companies need to report to the Taxi and Limousine Commission. This way they can get out of having to pay drivers more on each trip. Not only now, but really for years to come. The companies already weakened the amount of time that the drivers are supposed to be paid for the entirety of their shift. As a result of that weakening of that rule, which happened last March 2023, we estimate that drivers have already lost about $5,000 of income for the year. Now, with the manipulations of the lockouts, drivers are working with tremendous stress and anxiety and insecurity, and they're driving around aimlessly. Nobody is paying for that time. That time is not even being counted. And so the amount that they're earning on the trips when they are allowed back online is not keeping up with all of the hours that they're working. And on top of that, Uber and Lyft are now manipulating the empty time that the Taxi and Limousine Commission will review in January 2025 for the average empty time in 2024. So we're talking about a loss of income for drivers anywhere from like $5,000 to $7,000 for the year. And really the threat, because these companies have been astroturfing, they've been telling the drivers that they're being forced to lock out the drivers because of this existing rule. The reality is the rule that they're fighting is one that they've already weakened in their advantage, and two, it is a rule that is there to protect the drivers. We need that rule to be fixed so drivers can be paid for all hours that they work, including their empty time.
Bhairavi, let me also ask you to what extent, you've made phenomenal efforts and brought people together. You've brought people from Uber and Lyft together with the Taxi Workers Alliance as a formidable workforce. Tell us a little bit about who the workers are, and the nature of the industry, because I think there's still this general view that it's just a couple of hours of pocket change after the kids get home from school, or that it's part-time. Of course, that's the way it's projected. They allow for great freedom, but give us a better sense of the strategic nature to people's lives, the fact that it's a good proportion are immigrants. And I'm curious whether or not you're taking these issues nationally. And by the way, I have to say, can you imagine she's feeling a bit frail tonight, Bhairavi Desai, our executive director? Can you imagine when she's not? So we don't want to exhaust you too much, but your information to us so that we understand the industry better and we're able to provide the support we need for our siblings.
Oh no, thank you, Mimi. I appreciate your kind care. We're so happy to be able to talk about our struggle, and especially with BAI listeners who we hope will, stand in solidarity with us. Drivers are just the most amazing people. I mean, in New York City, we have the largest taxi for hire vehicle industry in the country. So we have yellow cabs, Uber and Lyft, neighborhood liveries or car services, and corporate black cars, and then green cabs. Collectively, drivers today, post-COVID, serve about 800,000 people every single day. And 90% of that work is now done by Uber and Lyft drivers. The thing in common across the sectors, across these subsectors in our industry, is the majority of the costs are borne by the drivers. The risks to their life is taken by the driver. The customer service is provided by the driver. The driver is the ambassador for the city of New York. And in the case of Uber and Lyft, they're the brand ambassador for these Wall Street darlings. And, even when they're driving empty, these companies collect data off their labor. And so they don't have to pay for the companies don't have to pay the operating expenses to do this job. The drivers pay for the vehicle. They could be renting or owning the vehicle. They pay for, of course, the gasoline, there's a number of electric vehicles now, so they pay for the charging, even though the, charging can take several hours of your day, and you're not compensated for that. Many drivers drive what's called wheelchair accessible vehicle, a WAVE, and, they pay for the retrofitting, which can be very expensive on its own. So you're talking, of course, insurance, regular maintenance. You're talking about financing costs that can be as much as $90,000 for that vehicle. This is just for Uber and Lyft drivers. Of course, when we talk about yellow cab drivers, there's also the medallion. But if for the moment we could focus on Uber and Lyft drivers, Uber has become a household name. It's become a verb. It's not just the name of a company. People will say, I'm going to Uber, right? All that has happened. That level of achievement for this company has happened because of the blood and the sweat and the tears of the drivers. And yet every single study has shown, and there was a big article in Newsweek recently which talked about how, and something that Uber admitted in court in 2019, which is that Uber has consistently charged passengers more and has been paying drivers less. They've been taking a higher and higher percentage of like a commission on each fare, while they're charging the public more. And so the drivers on some, in some trips, they're earning maybe, 40% of what the passenger paid. And, these companies very famously began, by telling the public, you don't have to tip the driver. And, by the time they put tipping in as an option, they changed the culture, the ridership culture. And so at one point, studies showed that about 2% of the drivers, Uber and Lyft drivers, would even get a tip. In fact, there was a recent study which found that delivery workers, like Uber Eats workers, will get tipped, and it's still not very much. Will get tipped at a higher percentage than, let's say, Uber and Lyft drivers. And you all know that tips are important to service workers, whether they be, restaurant staff or Uber and Lyft drivers or delivery workers. But part of what this business model has done is really diminished labor standards, and really exploited the amount of wealth that that they're able to appropriate for themselves on the backs of the drivers. And that's why we've been organizing and fighting back. And last week we had the largest known demonstration in person of drivers anywhere in the country, where over 2,000 drivers marched to Uber's headquarters with signs that say "Ready to Strike." Because if the current latest crisis of lockouts and low pay are not addressed by the companies, we need an agreement from the companies to our demands, and we need the Taxi and Limousine Commission to codify that agreement, and we need the TLC to stay strong and not compromise in its negotiations with the companies. We know that the world only follows when the workers lead. And so we've been doing that work of leading on the streets so that we can win this campaign.
Oh, yes, you have. And is there a number or a particular person that we should give a demonstrative shout out to support our Uber and Lyft drivers? And we'll have you back when you're in a little better voice and feeling a little stronger to talk about whether or not this movement's going national. And again, the whole issue of the hardworking immigrants that move this city and cities across the country. So whom do we shout out to?
Well, you can contact the New York Taxi Workers Alliance by calling us at 718-706-9892. Again, that's 718-706-9892. Our strategies in terms of direct organizing against Uber and Lyft, as well as moving the mayor and the Taxi and Limousine Commission, these strategies are in formation. But what you all should know, especially the drivers that are listening, is the drivers have the power to end the crisis of lockouts, and we must do it in a way that does not further compromise driver income. Uber would end the lockouts now if the drivers agree to give up more. And our response to that is drivers don't have anything left to give up. When they want us to give back, we as a labor movement, we say fight back. And so you can call our union office to know the latest strategy and the latest action. We plan to put out a petition for both drivers and the public to sign. And really for the next stage for the drivers is for us to have a strike notice march. March where we give the actual notice for the date of the strike, where we will go on strike unless our demands are met.
And we'll be there with you as the consumers to support our striking, and we hope they don't have to, but if they do, we're there, our striking workers. And we've been speaking with Bhairavi Desai, Executive Director of the Taxi Workers Alliance, raising the challenge to Uber and Lyft to stop the practice of lockouts of workers so they can get paid what the real-time work hours are and for the energies that go into that extremely important job because they move this city. Bhairavi Desai, lots more to discuss. We'll have you back, not to mention discussions about what we were talking about earlier, or you were, and that is Project 2025. Thanks so much, and heal and rest that voice, that wonderful, wonderful voice for the working class.
Thank you so much, Mimi, and thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Always our pleasure. And we're going to move quickly now to Richard Becker.